Good evening. I'm Dr. David Downing, the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois, and I'm delighted this evening to talk to you about a book by Dr. Holly Ordway, the author of Tolkien's Modern Reading. This is a groundbreaking book, which I think will be important for quite a while. Dr. Ordway is the Fellow of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute and a visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she's the author of Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach to defending the faith, and another book, Not God's Type, an atheist academic lays down her arms. She is also a subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies and a published poet. Her newest book is Tolkien's Modern Reading, the one we'll be talking about tonight, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, from Word on Fire Press, Academic, 2021, which is right now. And she has a website at hollyordway.com. So I'm very glad to welcome Holly to tonight's presentation. And my co-host will be Laura Schmidt, who's the archivist at the Wade Center and also an expert on Tolkien. So I really am going to enjoy this conversation. Welcome to you, Holly.
Well, thank you so much, David and Laura, for having me on. And it's a special honor to be doing this book launch for Tolkien's Modern Reading with the Wade, because I have spent many hours in the Wade Center doing research for this very book, as Laura can attest, 2 separate visits, a couple days each time, and many emails asking Laura, could you track down this article and that article from the archives? And on top of that, to have had the honor to receive the Clyde Kilby Research Grant for this book. So I have a lot to be thankful to the Wade for, and so it's just a real pleasure to be here.
Okay, thank you so much, Holly. I'm going to remind people as they're listening to your presentation tonight or listening to our conversation, they can put their questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll have time at the end of the meeting to pose some of these questions to you as the author. And also at the end of this conversation, we're going to have 3 free books sent out to people who have tuned in tonight or listening tonight. So let's turn things over to Laura Schmidt, our archivist, for the first question to Holly about her book.
Yes, and I just want to add what a delight it's been to see this research process, Holly. And I just love seeing things come to fruition in a published book that then ends back up on the Wade Center shelves for people to enjoy and watch that whole cycle evolve. It's always fun, always fun. So to get us started here, it took you, we've learned, 10 years to complete this work. You really took quite a lot of time to research and do scholarship in this area. So we wanted to begin by asking what motivation led you to this project and why you felt it was necessary. What led you to do this book in general?
Well, this book really, has been the fruition of a long process. Trying to trace back, I could easily go back 30 years, because that's about how long I've been seriously thinking about Tolkien. Ever since as a teenager, I stumbled across his great essay on fairy stories and discovered basically my ticket to literary criticism. Tolkien really showed me that you can enjoy someone's works and think about how does it work as a piece of literature. And that just mind-blowing to me. And I went on and did my PhD, University of Massachusetts Amherst, focused it on modern fantasy, on the genre, how did it develop? And so Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was a key piece in that, and his essay on fairy stories. But I was looking at the larger context of what came before Tolkien, how did the genre develop after it? So after having finished that, and went on, was teaching, 10 years is ticking on after I finished that dissertation. But the question was still kind of in my mind of, okay, well, there was all this fantasy literature before Tolkien. So I knew that Tolkien's work hadn't come out totally out of nowhere. I knew there were other fantasy authors like William Morris and Lord Dunsany, people like that, George MacDonald. And it just started kind of bugging me. Did Tolkien know about these authors? What did he think about them? And so I started kind of asking myself, gee, I wonder what Tolkien had read. And I wonder what he had read of modern fantasy in general, of modern literature in general. And so I decided to ask the question and find out. And I had no idea at the time that it was going to take me 10 years and produce this epic volume. I'm not sure I would have been a little bit like Bilbo stepping out of his front door, you know, where am I going? But it's been quite an exciting journey, just answering that question. Because when I started out, I honestly did not know the answer to that question. That's why I asked it. I said, well, what has he read? And let's find out.
Right. It's very Tolkienian to follow the road where it goes too. And
exactly.
Yes. Excellent.
There is this longstanding there's this longstanding conception that Tolkien stopped reading after Chaucer and the Gawain poet, and basically was not interested in modern reading. And what made you suspect that this idea, I think going all the way back to Humphrey Carpenter's biography of Tolkien in the 70s, what made you suspect that was an incorrect conception and make you dig into all these more recent authors as influences on Tolkien's writing?
Well, that's a great question, because I, in fact, did not have this realization until about probably 6 years into this 10-year project. Because again, I was looking for what had he read. And I distinctly remember being kind of excited when my list of authors topped 24, you know, woohoo, 25 authors that I can prove that Tolkien read. And by the way, I'm at almost 150 in the book.
Wow.
But I remember being excited when I had, you know, a couple dozen, precisely because all of the things I was reading were taking it for granted that he didn't read modern literature.
Right.
You know, and fundamentally, you know, Humphrey Carpenter's biography, where he's the authorized biographer, and he says straight up in the biography, Tolkien read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. Boom. You know, I mean, there you go. He's the authorized biographer. Okay. So I assumed that was correct. And I assumed that I was finding the few exceptions. And then I kept piling up more exceptions and more exceptions. And I kept looking, you know, I wanted to find whatever there was to be found. I wanted to find it. And then by the time I got to this, you know, I think when I tipped over about 100, I started thinking, you know, I'm not sure that this is correct. I really think there's something wrong here. And then as I inched over to more like 150, I realized, no, this is incorrect. And it was at that point that I started looking at Carpenter specifically, and I started asking some hard questions about, well, why did he say that? And how is it that he could say this? And what was his attitude? And discovering that really his statement had not a lot of reliability behind it, and really made me step back and reconsider my whole view of Carpenter, based on the fact that he's just completely wrong on this. He makes this flat out statement that's just simply incorrect. And the reason I challenge it in Tolkien's Modern Reading is that I discovered simply evidence to the contrary. Because I didn't start out thinking he was wrong. I actually started out assuming he was right. And then realizing I can't square this with the evidence. You know, we have 200 odd titles and 150 authors saying, yeah, Tolkien actually did read modern fiction and he did take serious notice of it. What's going on here?
I think you're right. I think usually after you have 100 exceptions to the rule, it's time to question the rule.
Does the rule actually exist?
Exactly. And
there is no rule.
Principle, yeah.
And really, you know, Tolkien scholarship has really been laboring under this one rule to bind them all, that, you know, that this idea that insofar as Tolkien read modern literature, that everything was an exception. Because there have been a lot of studies, and I've got them in my bibliography, you know, that do engage with readings of particular modern works. There's lots of them. The problem, though, is that pretty much across the board, everybody thinks that they've found an exception. Like, okay, sure, he didn't read modern literature, except for this one, and except for that one. But the whole point is they're not exceptions. There is no rule. Let's just throw the rule out, and then we'll have a clearer picture, you know?
And in addition to Carpenter being the authorized biographer, he also had unique access to materials that are in the Bodleian Library that very few scholars have gotten a chance to look at.
Right.
So I think there has been this trend that everybody just kind of blindly accepted what he said. And in recent years, that's been more questioned, his approach, and also if there is bias there and which things he chose to use from the Bodleian papers and such. So there's opportunity for a lot of different new exploration, I think, in that area, especially if and when these materials become available to other scholars in the future. So not only for maybe a new biography, but a new edition of letters, all those kinds of things could be possibilities and just broaden our view of Tolkien studies in general. And this book is an important milestone, I think, in that stepping stone process for sure. So Holly, what research methods and parameters did you use when you were creating this book, and how did you avoid the pitfalls that maybe other scholars have fallen into with their assumptions, maybe based on Carpenter or other sources, thinking of Tolkien more as a medievalist or not reading modern literature?
Well, first of all, I did have to set out some parameters. So I picked 1850 as my cutoff date for modern, because that's nice and objective. That way I don't have any sort of dithering. If 1849, not in this book, 1850, it's in the book. And that's a good marker for modernity. And it's things that were contemporary for Tolkien growing up, basically. And that provided a good cutoff date. And so my approach in the book was to go for what I called the certains, books that we could have, or authors that we could have evidence that Tolkien definitely knew. So, and I really zeroed in on that. So it had to be somebody that he mentions. He mentions the author, he mentions a specific work, or he makes a reference that is clearly can be traced to that author or that work. Because sometimes you can make a reference to something that indicates that he knew the work in question, even if he has forgotten the title, for instance, or if he owned it. Or those are the primary ones. If he mentions it in an interview, shows familiarity to the author that way, or if a family member, friend, student refers to Tolkien as having known that author, I took that as being evidence as well. So all of those things were different pieces of evidence, where they mentioned him in his letters and his writings. Those were all ways that I tracked down, did he know this book? Now, granted, just because he had the book on his shelves doesn't necessarily mean that he read it, but it at least shows that he was familiar with it. And that shows that he at least knew the book. Or if he gave the book as a gift to someone, had he read it all the way through? Maybe he didn't, but he knew it well enough that he gave it as a gift. So these were the things that I looked at.
I appreciate that concrete evidence that you're using, and pushing back against trying to make assumptions, or even saying, well, he read this author, he probably read this. You make it very clear in the book and are very transparent about whether or not there's a source to cite that he did indeed read this book. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks. And that really is something that I set my mind to do because of some of the frustrations I had with the current scholarship, where someone would mention, oh, Tolkien knew this book. And I would be all excited, and I would trace down the citation, and it turns out that it was actually, it was the kind of book people read at that time. Well, that's not the same thing. Or, well, there's many thematic similarities. That's not the same thing. Or C.S. Lewis knew the book. That's not the same thing. Lewis and Tolkien are not conjoined twins.
Right.
They didn't share the same, mental space. So that really was clarified for me by the frustration of having to kind of sort through, because there are some really useful literary analyses that you can do by looking at books that are thematically the same or in the same, cultural milieu. There's some really valuable work done there, but you have to be clear about what it is you're doing. That's not the same thing as saying, this is a book that Tolkien read. Mm-hmm. So every author that I talk about in the book is an author that we have evidence that Tolkien knew, every single one. And all of the books that I treat in detail are books that we know that Tolkien read. Mm-hmm. And this gives rise to some very curious distortions in the scholarship, because, for instance, there's actually more scholarship on Tolkien's reading of John Buchan than of many other figures that he mentions. But we actually only have one reference to Buchan, really, from Carpenter saying that Tolkien read John Buchan. Granted, it's a good indication, because Carpenter is so dismissive of Tolkien's reading that any mention of it is a good counter evidence. I think we can, trust that. Mm-hmm. But Carpenter doesn't mention any of the specific titles. And I actually managed to track down, finally, evidence that Tolkien had, in fact, read Greenmantle. But that's the only one that I could find actual evidence he had read that title. And so that's the one that I discuss in Tolkien's Modern Reading. So there's lots of interesting things that one can say about other Buchan titles, and Tolkien probably read them. But I didn't put them in because we don't know that he read them. And it makes a very different approach. And I think it gave me more confidence to do the analysis that I did because I'm dealing with facts.
And in addition to these obscure interviews or newspaper articles or things that you've tracked down, which I know because I've helped you do it through the Wade's collections, you use sources like Hammond and Scull's chronology and other sources that have an authoritative credibility to them so that we can feel good about that source and that citation. I don't know if you want to comment any further about that or not, but.
I will briefly. I mean, Hammond and Scull, I mean, their 3-volume 2017, companion guide is just absolutely the gold standard. And I think it hasn't even been used as much as it ought to be in Tolkien studies. It's an absolute treasure trove because they are meticulous.
They are. Yeah.
It's amazing. And it was actually interesting. There were a fair few times that in my research, I came across something and I thought to myself, oh, so that's where Hammond and Scull got that from. Came across independently. And of course, every single time they had it accurately. So this is again a confirmation as if we needed it, which we didn't. Right. But Hammond and Scull is a fantastic resource, underutilized. But primarily what I was doing is I was going to the primary sources. They're really the only exception, as far as a secondary source. So I was going at these interviews. And one thing that I realized is that Tolkien scholarship and Inkling scholarship in general, has tended to kind of default to a relatively small handful of interviews. And the same quotes keep cropping up again and again. And so when I set myself to go past that and track down the more obscure interviews, some of them quite short, but it's amazing what interesting tidbits you get. And I really commend the scholars like Stuart Lee doing that extended edition. They tracked down the rest of the BBC interview with Tolkien. That is good scholarship, going past the same bits that we all knew about and actually tracking down the original transcripts. I mean, that was a great gift to this research. But even things like, I listened to lots of audio interviews, Oxfordshire History Center recordings. I listened to recordings of talks at the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford, including ones that, never been shared or publicized. And for instance, George Sayer did a talk in the 80s, I think it was, to the Society. And it was in that talk, this very kind of, grainy, poor quality audio recording. You can hear his voice. And he mentions, oh yeah, and Tolkien highly praised the poetry of Dylan Thomas. And I hit pause really quickly and rewound. Did he really say that? Yes, here we have George Sayer mentioning as a kind of matter of fact, oh yes, Tolkien highly praised the poetry of Dylan Thomas. Right, that I had not come across anywhere else because I asked the archivist of the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society, please could I listen to the audio of any speakers who talked about Tolkien? And they obliged. And that's where I found that tidbit.
It's wonderful. And those little personal memories from people who knew him or, his own children saying, oh yeah, I remember my dad reading that book. That's the kind of work you've done to really pull all these disparate pieces together to have a full picture to bless the rest of us with. So we finally can see the whole thing for what it's worth, right? That's right. So fascinating.
I just read a memoir of George Sayer on Tolkien in that Joseph Pearce anthology of essays. And he says, Tolkien just loved children. Sayers took him to a mass, and immediately Tolkien started introducing himself to this family with young children and helping them with a prayer book. And at the end of the service, they said, "Oh, mommy, can we meet that nice man again? He was so helpful in church." And I love the image of this famous author being in church, meeting children, and helping them through the prayer book and the service. And at the end, they wanted to see more of Tolkien. It was such a charming story. It shows how much you learn from secondary sources. Can I ask, as long as I've got the mic here, can I ask what was your most surprising author? We would kind of say, oh yes, Tolkien knew the Eddas, he knew Beowulf, he knew Chaucer, he knew these other authors. And you might even say with modern authors, of course, he knows some George MacDonald, he knows Andrew Lang, who did all these great fairy stories in his various books. Which one did you just say, wow, I can't believe that Tolkien read? Well, you just said Dylan Thomas. Who else would you say, wow, I did not expect to find that at all as someone who Tolkien read and admired?
Well, probably an author that really made me sit up was realizing that Tolkien took seriously the work of James Joyce.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that was fascinating. And what was particularly interesting is I knew already from Dimitri Fimi, Andrew Higgins' great book, A Secret Vice, that he had made these notes on Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which was interesting. So I knew there were those notes. But what really fascinated me was when I started looking at the date that he made those notes and when Joyce was writing Finnegan's Wake. And it turns out that what Tolkien had read was actually the first part that at that point published called Anna Livia Pluribel. It was the first part of the book, and he had to have read it within a few months of it coming out. So not only do we have Tolkien engaging seriously, making serious, thoughtful notes about Joyce's work, but he's doing it about something that just came out. It's not like it's been kicking around forever and he finally gets around to thinking about it. And so this really gives us a very different picture of Tolkien as somebody not just who's aware of what's going on, but he's really got his finger on the pulse of the modern literature. He's interested. It just came out and there he is. He's reading it. He's interested.
Yeah, that is unusual. Yeah.
I remember too from reading the book that he read Dune by Frank Herbert, which was another surprising thing to me because you forget sometimes where these people align contextually in history and how long Tolkien did live. He was able to read some of these things and, they're making a movie about Dune right now. And there's probably a lot of Dune fans that are also Lord of the Rings fans. So that was interesting to know that he read it. He read it. So if you want to know, maybe, I don't remember if Holly notes what he thought about it, but you got to read the book to see what the reference is there. Speaking of, these modern authors are forgetting how long Tolkien lived. He passed away in 1973. There's a couple other really important points that you bring up in the book that I want to make sure we address. One is thinking about Tolkien as a modern author, not just engaging in modern literature, but taking him out of the sphere of being a medievalist and letting him be a 20th century author. That's very important. As well as thinking about Tolkien's direct quotes and how they're interpreted. So those are kind of two key points that I want to let you talk about. But I do have a nice quote that we both enjoy from Verlyn Flieger about Tolkien as a modern author. And I want to read that. This is from her book, which is an essay collection, Green Suns and Fairy, published in 2012. Verlyn says, "We must abandon our preconceptions and start seeing and reading Tolkien as a man of his time. We must take him out of the medieval box into which he has languished for too long and set him solidly in the context of the 20th century that shaped him and produced his work." And in fact, Verlyn separates out a third of that volume just to essays discussing Tolkien as a modern author. So she saw that as important. So this book, your book, really follows that trend that I'm seeing in other Tolkien scholarship contexts as well. So do you want to comment about that at all, Holly?
Yes, I mean that book was important for the research that I did, and seeing Flieger and a few other important scholars making this call. I mean, she's basically putting out the call saying, "Come on, let's do it." So I said, "Okay, I will," because she really is calling for exactly the kind of thing that we need. And I think, kind of what we said before, people weren't answering that call. I think because they felt like, well, there just isn't the evidence. Or we have to wait until the archives are opened. Well, it'll be great if and when those are. I would love to see more material, but it turns out there's a kind of a lot that's actually already available if we just roll up our sleeves and go looking. Yes. And I think putting him in the context as a modern author, I mean, that's just so important. And it's fascinating to see, the reception history of his work, because, even in his lifetime, people were trying to shove him in that box. It's interesting how people would make these assumptions that because he was a medievalist, which he was, is very important to understand that.
Absolutely.
It's critical to his work, but they wanted to kind of circumscribe him, kind of make his work, easily compressed, maybe make it safer, less challenging. I don't know. So we have, for instance, an interviewer that's interviewing Tolkien And he makes some dismissive comment about, the news, basically assuming that Tolkien doesn't read the newspaper at all. And Tolkien says, oh no, I take 3 newspapers. And he goes on to add, he's very interested in the news, the local news, the national news, and the international news. So he underscores that point because people just wanted to pigeonhole him as like, oh no, he must be just an old fuddy-duddy stuck in the past, even in his own time. And he had to say, no, I don't. I read the newspaper. I'm interested in international news. Thank you very much. So I think we have to kind of push against these preconceptions in his day as well about, well, if he's interested in medieval literature, he must only be interested in that, which is actually, kind of a silly preconception, but a very lasting one, oddly enough.
And I think John Garth points out in his book, Tolkien and the Great War, that Tolkien lived through this tragedy that really does almost separate the past from the modern era. And he was himself trying to make sense of what could be preserved and needs to be, kept as we move forward, into modernity. And there's a lovely quote that you talk about in your book on page 291 here, Tolkien's Modern Reading. And it refers to how the vessel in which Tolkien wanted to bring us along, which is that of fantasy literature. That was his way of communicating how this change needs to take place, bringing things from the past into the future, the current situation, and then into the future with us. So you say, in choosing fantasy as his preferred literary form to address these concerns, about how to translate the past, Tolkien was not rejecting realism as a literary mode, but rather finding his own voice. In doing so, he appeared to some to be turning his back on the 20th century, but in fact, he was engaging with it all the more profoundly. And I love that. I love thinking about Tolkien almost driving a car into the future, and he's constantly checking his rear view mirror to be like, what do we have to remember? Maybe he even packed some stuff into the trunk in the back seat. He's got the archives back there of the past, but he's on the highway, going towards the future and modernity and trying to take us all along with him. And he's doing that through the vessel of story. That's how he himself is making sense of it as an artist, as a creator. And he's encouraging all of us to kind of almost capture our hearts in a way and say, yes, these are precious things, but translated them in a way that we can all understand as modern people.
Yeah. And one of the images I kept coming across is some of his students talked about him as a translator. And speaking of him in terms of his teaching of medieval literature, one of his students talked about how he could translate from the world of the medieval mind to the modern world. And that really struck me because in order to be a translator, you have to know both languages. If he had been totally immersed in the past, he might have understood the past better than anybody, but he wouldn't have been able to communicate it. But in fact, he was a profoundly gifted communicator about medieval literature. And I think that insight is really crucial. You can only be a bridge if you've got a base on both sides of the river. And I think we kind of take that so for granted that we forget we can understand, we can relate so well to what Tolkien is doing with his fantasy stories that draw on these medieval themes, precisely because he has engaged so deeply with modern culture. And this is a case where reading some of his predecessors really helped, because for instance, William Morris, I know some people do still enjoy William Morris. I read all the William Morris books out of a sort of sense of duty, as it by the end. Morris is very much stuck in the medieval past. He is trying to recreate a medieval mindset. And they're interesting books. They're a distinctive flavor, but they do not resonate with modernity. There's a reason why Morris, insofar as he gets reprinted as a curiosity, as look, he's an author that inspired Tolkien. Nobody reads William Morris for William Morris. And for a good reason. He doesn't have anything particularly profound to say to the 20th century or the 21st century. And I think if you look at that, all of a sudden you look at the Lord of the Rings and you say, that is a completely different thing. Tolkien is doing something totally different than Morris, and he's engaging with all themes of power, of totalitarianism, of the question of the machine, of death. Somebody who lived through the First World War and had his sons fighting in the Second World War. This is somebody who is speaking to the modern world in a profound way, And I think we can just take that too much for granted. But looking at what he was drawing on really puts that into a kind of a sharp contrast. And you can say, wow, he really is a modern author.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think the thing that makes you a modern author is that you engage modern readers. I can imagine a conversation with a literary agent where somebody says, well, he's kind of medieval and he's stuck in the past and he really doesn't read anything beyond 1850. And then the agent would say, well, how does books sell? Well, The Hobbit sold about 100 million and Lord of the Rings sold about 150 million. And the agent would go, what are you talking about? That he's medieval, he's stuck in the past. It's very obvious by the fact that he engages readers that he's clearly a modern author. He speaks to today's reading audience. I wanted to go to a different question, which is, you did a wonderful job of tracking down sources. Often people will read in the letter that he read Lord Dunsany or read Andrew Lang or some other name. And you actually went back and read the original author and looked for the similarity between the source and how Tolkien used it. And often you made a very good case that he improved on the source. Sometimes you say, oh, this phrase came from that, Wordsworth or Dunsany or something. Could you give us an example of somewhere that Tolkien read it, but having read it, he digested it and he understood how to make that even more memorable and vivid for modern readers? Can you talk about, as you look through the sources, you said, oh, well, that's good, but Tolkien's use of it is even better. Could you give us a couple examples of that?
Well, I have one particular that I'll talk to you about, but I think that the most notable thing is that I could say that about everything that I cover, because that was something that really was significant that I just observed as I looked through the material, because it wasn't just a case of, I identify this source and it gets plugged in somewhere. Not at all. Tolkien himself repeatedly uses the image of mulch, of trees from leaves from the Tree of Tales falling into the ground, breaking down into mulch and getting drawn up again. And that, he understood the way his own unconscious worked, because that's exactly what happens. Things get broken down and assimilated, and everything gets transformed, and his genius transforms them into things that are better. So I'll give you one specific example, and I'm going to share my screen here and give you a picture.
Oh,
so,
goody. We're in for a treat.
Yes.
I want to just mention the photo gallery in this book is fantastic. There's, I think, 40 different illustrations that Holly has included, all in full color.
So yes, I'm delighted with the photo gallery, because I wanted also to give you some sense of the materials that Tolkien's working with. What do these books look like? That was actually another thing that I did. As much as I could, I tried to get my hands on copies of the books of the same editions that Tolkien would have known. And that was itself actually quite interesting, gave me some interesting leads at times. So you should be seeing a picture of some wolves in a tree. This is the frontispiece from a book called The Black Douglas by S.R. Crockett. And Tolkien himself names this scene in the book as a source of inspiration for the warg scene in The Hobbit. And this is particularly notable because this is a source that Tolkien himself not only identifies that Crockett's Black Douglas is the material, but he even identifies how it's used in his own work. And so that provided an opportunity for me to look at, well, what did Crockett do and what did Tolkien do? And the fact that the book happens to have a really great illustration of that exact scene, I thought was notable as well, because Tolkien has a very powerful visual imagination, which I think has also been somewhat overlooked, although it's getting more attention now. So there are a couple of things about this scene that Tolkien improved upon. We have here a scene where the heroes are being pursued by some wolves, and they have to fight them off, and then eventually day comes and they're safe. And it has the pine trees, it has the wolves kind of howling with almost human voices. There's blue lightning in the background. There's lots of details that map onto the warg scene. But what Tolkien does is he takes all of these things and he heightens them. So the wolves in Crockett's story have voices that sound almost like speech, But in The Hobbit, they actually are speaking in a wolf language that's cruel and horrible. In Crockett's story, there's this sort of blue lightning in the background as kind of atmospheric detail. And in The Hobbit, Tolkien makes it a significant part of the story because it's the lightning that Gandalf is using, to try and blast the wargs and save them. And interestingly, there's two other things that are notable about Tolkien's handling of the scene. One is that he actually decreases the amount of violence in it. In Crockett's, there's lots of killing of wolves. Lots of them, you can see there's several wolves being slaughtered in this picture. And in the warg scene, he actually decreases the violence, but increases the dramatic tension. It's a much more dramatically effective scene. And he also plays down the religious element in it. In Crockett's scene, one of the characters actually says a prayer, a Christian prayer, and then the cock crows and the rooster is a symbol of Christ, and then day breaks and they're saved. And so it's a fairly blatant introduction of like kind of a Christian theme into the story. And Tolkien was very much of the mind that the Christian element was there, but he preferred to have it be below the conscious level of the story. So he removes that overt piece, but very interestingly, he retains it thematically in the way that's the eagles that come and rescue him. The eagle is a profound Christian symbol. It's the symbol of the evangelist St. John, who, by the way, was not only a name that Tolkien had, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, but he had a special devotion to St. John the Evangelist. Mm-hmm. So we see this little subtle Christian thread woven in for those who have eyes to see it, but it wasn't overt and blatant and in your face the way Crockett did it. So we have, I think in this, an instance of Tolkien's deftness, his adeptness in taking a vivid image, a vivid scene, and just improving it on every level.
Mm-hmm. Right. I was also struck by the scene with wolves in Lord of the Rings. After Carhadras, they're surrounded by these demon wolves or these wraith wolves, and Tolkien says, be gone, you hound of Sauron. And in the novel, we're never quite clear if Sauron sent these wargs or these hounds to harass them after they came down from Carhadras. But when I read the Black Douglas, I think, he just assumed these were some kind of demonic fiends. So it helps enrich your understanding of what's going on in that scene of Lord of the Rings because you've read the Black Douglas. Did you compare that also to the scene in Lord of the Rings as well as The Hobbit?
I didn't. I actually stuck just with The Hobbit because that's the one that Tolkien himself identifies as being the scene that it was the inspiration for. Uh-huh. But again, because of the way his creative imagination works, I have no doubt that having thought of the wargs, which were inspired by the scene in Crockett, that undoubtedly was a factor in the later warg scene that we see in The Lord of the Rings. So I think there's kind of a genealogical connection between the wargs sort of, working its way through his legendarium.
Right.
You mentioned before, Holly, the way that Tolkien's mind works and the leaf mold of the mind and his creativity. And you have another quote in here that I just love. Another question that I want people to think about is, what value does Tolkien's modern reading have, not only for scholarship, but for a better understanding of Tolkien and his works? And one quote I think you had that really spoke to that is, on page 287, you say, our approach to Tolkien's work will be liberated. We will be able to roam freely back and forth across the centuries as he did in order to consult all the leaves of all the trees that drop down into the mulch of his creativity. And I just loved that visual image of being able to just dance beneath the trees, not just like have this walled off section of all the medieval trees that we could look at, but every tree's fair game now. We can go look underneath all of them and see what the leaf mold of Tolkien's mind was. So do you have any other comments on that? It's almost like Luthien gets to dance where she wants to now,
I know, it's very exciting. I mean, this has been an exciting project because, as I said at the beginning, I had no idea when I started that I would end up here. And so when I wrapped it up, I was kind of stunned, like, wow, this is exciting. And I had to set the firm limits. Only books in English, not in other languages. And Tolkien knew other languages. Only, literature, not nonfiction. Only after 1850. I had to set those hard limits because otherwise it would have been even a longer book and I would working on
30
it.
years, 30 years, 40 years research.
There needs to be, I mean, I must say, I came to appreciate Tolkien's creative process sort of from the inside. I used to wonder how he could have taken so long to write The Lord of the Rings. Now I understand. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a certain Tolkienian mindset that I got myself into. But it also made me realize that there's so much in between the end of the Middle Ages and 1850 that, we haven't attended to. Unfortunately, I'm starting to see been some good work. There's a recent book on Tolkien in the classical world. I'm starting to see there's new stuff come out. I'm so excited to see this. This is as it should be. And I would love to see some work on Tolkien and, the 18th century writers, the 17th century writers, because I came across a comment from his grandson, Michael, that when Michael was doing his own literary studies, that his grandfather had very amusing comments to make about Jonathan Swift, that he really enjoyed Jonathan Swift. So there you have it. Jonathan Swift was one of Tolkien's favorite authors. Who knew, right? And of course, I couldn't go there because 1850, but please, somebody look at Tolkien and Jonathan Swift, because we know he thought highly of him. So let's look at it.
The door has been opened. This book really has showed us a different view of where Tolkien scholarship could go after this point, I think. Yeah, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Could you comment on other authors? We talk about Jonathan Swift and Lord Dunsany and more remote authors. I was fascinated by the section on Lewis and Tolkien and how Tolkien helped Lewis get Out of the Silent Planet published, but he also may have been influenced by Out of the Silent Planet. Can you talk a little bit about how Lewis may have gotten into some of Tolkien's thoughts in The Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, that was really fascinating because we knew already that Tolkien had a high view of Out of the Silent Planet. It's in the letters, although again, not I think given as much attention as it merits. And Tolkien, in fact, knew all 3 volumes of Lewis's Ransom trilogy, and he particularly enjoyed Perelandra. But he liked Out of the Silent Planet a great deal. But did it have an influence on The Lord of the Rings? Yes, it did. And I came across a very interesting document in the History of Middle-earth, that massive, compilation of materials. There's actually a page of notes. When Tolkien was writing The Two Towers, he had just thought of Treebeard. It kind of come out of nowhere. And he's trying to make some notes on who is Treebeard and how does he fit in? He's trying to puzzle it over. And he asks himself in these notes, are these creatures, are they Hnau, H-N-A-U?
Right.
That's significant because that is an invented word that Lewis uses in Out of the Silent Planet to mean a rational being that has a moral sense. And it's clearly Lewis, because that's an invented word by Lewis in Out of the Silent Planet, the Hrasa, Hnau. And then, of course, some of the humans turn out not to be Hnau because they murder other Hnau. So it's a very important concept in Out of the Silent Planet about, are you not just an intelligent being, but a moral being? And Tolkien's using it to think through, what are the Ents? Are they Hnau that have gone tree-like, or are they trees that have become Hnau? And so he's using Lewis's concept to figure out what are the Ents. And I think that also helps us to understand his invention of the Huorns, because those are very clearly, they're Hnau who are going tree-like because they're kind of losing some of their kind of moral capacity. They're a bit dangerous and unpredictable. And when I had that thread, I was able to look back then Out of the Silent Planet. And then if you look at the Sorns and you look at the Ents, you see there is a very strong family resemblance. And there's a very strong connection between Aubrey, the Sorn that we see the most of in Out of the Silent Planet, and Treebeard himself. And I think it's too close to be coincidental. Now, Tolkien himself says that he didn't know where the Ents came from. He gives a couple of different kind of ideas where they came from. But Tolkien also admitted elsewhere that the process of inspiration is often unconscious. So I think he'd read and loved Out of the Silent Planet years before. That those Sorns were in his imagination, in that mulch. and he draws them up, and they present themselves when he needed them. And the fact that he uses the term now to talk about figuring out who the Ents are at this pivotal point in their creation is like the flag that says, look, here we have a connection. It was very, very exciting to see.
You talk about Tolkien saying yes or no to what influenced him, or not remembering where things came from. And that just brings up another point that we mentioned earlier about how we interpret Tolkien's quotes, his direct quotes verbatim, and maybe recontextualizing or better understanding or interpreting them. We just had an event with Trinity Forum. We co-sponsored it with Diana Glyer last week. I think that was just last Friday. Time flies. But she brought up an interesting point about how the Inklings and Tolkien might have interpreted the word influence. If somebody from their era might have thought of it as meaning that something was taken from somewhere else rather than just inspired by something, or they weren't having original thought or creativity. So I think that's something that's interesting to think about, and why people might have pushed back against or shied away from the term been influenced by. I don't know if you have anything to say to that directly, but also tell us a little bit about what is also a trend in Tolkien scholarship, is to rethink about how we're interpreting his direct quotes, or why we need to be cautious about how we're using those.
Yeah, I think it's a great point about, what did the Inklings themselves understand source and influence to mean? And if we go back, and again, Diana Glyer is great on this, they were quite rightly rejecting the idea that they were just copying. They're just rubber stamping. No. And they were really trying not to get pigeonholed as just imitators of each other. And so I think if we understand that, it really helps contextualize some of their rejections of, that he wasn't a source, he wasn't possibly an influence. Well, he wasn't copying him, right? But were there other things going on? Yes, there were. And I think Tolkien, he's such a complex personality. That's something that absolutely came through in my research. And there's so many people who said in interviews, Tolkien was complex. You could never get to the bottom of him. Clyde Kilby could not figure him out. He said he could describe C.S. Lewis, but he could not describe Tolkien. He was just so complex. And Tolkien's personality, he was a kind of interesting mix of opposites in a way. He could be very hyperbolic. Many of his friends commented on how he could exaggerate things to a ridiculous extent. There are numerous anecdotes of him, he kind of mock ferociously, kind of going over the top in argument and being, belligerent. And then instantly he's back to being smiling and fun and genial. And I think he had a big streak of the theatrical. And this is perfectly clear in an interpersonal conversation. But then when he gets theatrical and hyperbolic in an interview or a letter, and then someone who doesn't know him reads that decades later and takes it as a sober assessment of his views on something, then we can end up with some just misunderstandings of his views on things. And then, interestingly, there's also the fact that Tolkien is extraordinarily English in his habits of communication. And this is something that presented itself to me more after I've been going to England, spending up to a couple months there every year for about more than a decade now. English friends, I spent a lot of time in the same places that Tolkien did. And the English do communicate differently than Americans. Understatement, self-deprecation, it can actually be a bit baffling to an American until you get used to it. And Tolkien was English to the bone. And so he habitually used understatement when he's talked about things that were important to him. Like we see this in the opening of On Fairy Stories, where he says, far be it from me, I'm a mere amateur. I hardly know anything about this to presume to say something in this subject. And I once taught this essay to some undergraduates who actually took that at face value. And they said, well, why are you giving us this essay by this amateur? I'm like, no, you don't get it. He was actually conveying to his audience, who would have understood perfectly that meant I am a world-class authority in this subject and I'm about to lay down the law. And they would have been suitably impressed that he managed to convey that in the appropriate self-deprecating manner. We Americans don't always get that right away. And I noticed, had puzzled over this for years. There's an interesting combination where Tolkien is often the most hyperbolic and emphatic about the things that aren't important, and the most self-deprecating and sort of, quiet about the things that were really the most important to him. So until we recognize that Englishness of his communication, we can kind of get a lot of his comments completely back to front. But once you see that, it's like a click, and all of a sudden, a lot of what he's saying comes into focus, and you can understand a lot of what he's doing, where he'll say something really hyperbolic and then back down. Or you have to look at, what's the context? Was he just chaffing with his friends, or was he making a sober assessment in an academic essay? So context is something that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to than we have. And again, getting that overall picture of his personality, because when we do that, I mean, he's also much more fun, honestly, as an author, once you realize that he has this kind of quirkiness. It's a bit maddening. I'm like, Tolkien, could you just calm down sometimes? But it's fun. It makes him come alive, I think, to realize that he had this kind of lively personality.
You mentioned in the book too that some letters actually have redactions, so getting the full scope of what he said in a letter to someone, it might sound more curt or, rushed in a way, but we might not have the full content of that letter in the existing collected letters volume. So all of those little details really come into play when you're interpreting these direct primary sources.
Right. We had a question. We have a number. We're going to switch to questions at about 7:55, and then we're
got
going
about
to
5 minutes.
talk about 3 people who are going to get free signed copies for tuning in. But I wanted to talk a little bit. So several questions are coming up about the novel Dune. Did you make a timeline of something he read that might have influenced Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and something he read which showed he was keeping up with contemporary fiction, but obviously did not influence The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings? Something like Dune, I assume he read it, but it was too late in his reading life to have an influence on Lord of the Rings. Could you speak to?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's much too late. And he read it. We only know that he didn't particularly like it. We don't know anything else about his reaction. Just he didn't care for it. But yeah, it's really important to look at the chronology, and I do pay very close attention to that. And the books that he read early enough that he could have, that they could have had an influence on the Legendarium, I obviously pay more attention to. But I think it's also interesting and important to note his reaction, even to books that he read too late to be a direct influence, because it helps us see the shape of his mind. And fundamentally, that's what I wanted to do in Tolkien's modern reading. I make different arguments about influence and sources, and I think they're good arguments, obviously. I wrote them. But that actually isn't the main point. What I wanted to show is this is the shape of his creative imagination. Right. This is how it worked. These are the sources he took in and how he responded to them. And even just seeing what he liked, what he didn't like, and why sheds a tremendous amount of light. So even if it never became a direct influence, just seeing how he responded to things, really, I found it quite illuminating.
Right.
Before we shift to Q&A, I just want to make sure we get this one question in. We have a lot of speculation on what Tolkien wrote that we don't know for sure, but we'd love to know. So if you, Holly, could ask Tolkien himself about one work in particular to confirm a fact or a title that he read, which one would it be?
Well, I would have to say, I would ask him, Tolkien, what had you read of John Henry Newman's works? And Newman wrote a lot of poetry. He wrote the novel Loss and Gain. And of course, John Henry Newman would have been very notable to Tolkien as the founder of the Birmingham Oratory, where Tolkien, spent so much of his youth. His guardian had been a private secretary to Newman. Tolkien was a member of the National Newman Association for actually a number of additional years that we hadn't known about. I went up to Durham and researched in the Newman Association archives and found that Tolkien was quite extensively involved with them. So surely he must have read works by Newman. But unfortunately, we don't, at this point, have any direct evidence of what he had read. So therefore, Newman appears in Tolkien's modern reading only as an example of a book of an author that we don't know. He's not in the list of authors that Tolkien knew, because we don't have the evidence. I am morally certain that he had read books by Newman. I would love to know which ones, and I don't.
Oh,
Yes.
absolutely. There's a one clarification question that I want to just asked from the chat here. They were asking for the title again of the book we mentioned. I think they're referring to the Hammond and Skull 3-volume work, and then possibly also the companion and guide that's kind of like an annotated Lord of the Rings. Could you chime in on that, Holly, and just explain what that is so people are aware? And then I'm going to start looking at the Q&A box while you do that to select our next questions from folks who have been diligently typing them in here.
Right. Well, the Hammond and Skull have done a number of really important research works, and the companion guide is a 3-volume set. This is the updated 2017 edition. There's one volume that's a chronology that goes basically sometimes day by day or year by year through Tolkien's life, giving information about what he was doing at that time. And then a 2-volume reader's guide that just covers all sorts of different topics with Tolkien's life and work. And that's, mainly biographical, and to do with his work. And then there's also a Lord of the Rings Reader's Companion, which is a volume that's dedicated to, going in depth into the Lord of the Rings, which is a separate volume. So all of those excellent books, really essential resources for any serious scholar of Tolkien.
Thank you. All right, heading into the Q&A from you all, our viewers. Patrick asks, you noted on page 13 of your book, so it sounds like he's already read it. Well done, Patrick. Carpenter's subtle nips and tucks present us with a different face, less friendly, more forbidding. Is it possible that the public can access more letters that can provide a more illuminating and more friendly and less forbidding perspective? I love the book. Your style is just as compelling as the content. You're an iconoclast par excellence.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't actually have the letters to compare with for the most part. That's a significant gap. And we know that the letters have been cut because in the letters themselves, the volume, there's 354 letters, but most of them are incomplete. I mean, some of them are literally just one paragraph. So we know that there's been material that's been cut. And interesting was at the Wade that I discovered what an effect this could have, because we can suspect that those cuts influence our perception. But there's one letter that often gets referenced as an example of Tolkien disliking answering questions from fans. In the letters, it begins very curtly, I do not like giving biographical information about myself. And then he gives some information and then he just ends. And it comes across as kind of, cranky and abrupt. It turns out that the full text of the letter to a woman called Deborah Webster is published in a different volume, and which I was able to look at in the Wade. It's in Webster's own book. She prints the entirety of the letter. And in fact, Tolkien starts out with a very warm greeting, thanking her for her attention, saying he's sorry that he missed her. He appreciated a book that she gave him. And he says, but I don't really, like giving this information, but I will. Gives it a completely different tone. He started off, very warmly. So rather than being abrupt, it's kind of self-deprecating, that English, well, okay, I'll tell you. And then it ends with him showing gratitude for her interest. Again, a very different way to close, to thank her for her questions rather than just to stop abruptly as if he was fed up. So that to me is very illuminating to see an actual concrete example of how this abbreviation of the beginning and the end matter changes the tone in a significant way. It really gives a different perception of how Tolkien was relating to his readers. Totally different tone than actually appears in the complete letter.
Here's one I know that you answer in your book, and I think I'll just jump in with it because I'm sure you'll be excited to talk about it. Amy Barkhouse asks, have you found any connections to Tolkien's youth in Birmingham, the artistic movements localized there, pre-Raphaelite arts and crafts, and the enthusiasm for fairy belief at the turn of the century to his early literary or poetic work featuring fairies?
Well, his childhood in Birmingham is very interesting to me. Didn't get into that cultural element because that would have taken me a little bit off of the track of what he had read. But one important book that turned up was a book called John Inglesant by the Birmingham local author, J.H. Shorthouse. And actually, I will go ahead and share my screen here because I've got an image of him.
Oh boy, another photo.
Another photo. Let's see. Oops, let me see. Those are some. Here is Shorthouse himself. He was a local hero in Tolkien's own neighborhood because, in fact, the house that this chap J. Shorthouse lived in, Tolkien would have walked by it every day as he went to mass at the Birmingham Oratory. It's been demolished. There are no extant photographs of it. In the road pattern is a little bit different. By dint of quite a lot of extremely nerdy research, many hours in fact, I was able to track down exactly where the house was. And I went and explored on foot that neighborhood. So I can confirm that, in fact, Tolkien walked by this house every day and was able to get photographs of the street as it was, to see that it would have been a beautiful, big, beautiful houses in that time. Not now, unfortunately. So this author was a real local hero. He was well known. He even had a tea with the prime minister, and his book, John Inglesant, is one that Tolkien remarked upon in his letters as being important to him. And he even references the author as being a kind of, in a way, counter role model, because he calls him a melancholy warning, because Shorthouse got so hung up on his one book that he spent his whole life trying to explain what it meant. And I think Tolkien saw that as potentially a problem with Lord of the Rings, which you didn't want to have that problem. So we see that with John Inglesant and with J.H. Shorthouse, Tolkien had a real local hero of an author that's, that was important to him personally. And this book, John Inglesant, it was a bestseller at the time. Everybody was talking about it. It was in the newspapers for decades. Who now has heard of John Inglesant? Well, more people now, they read my book, but hitherto, pretty much nobody. And for me, that brought out two important things. One is the importance of looking at Tolkien's own context and chronology, because the vagaries of history, certain things just fall out of our attention because they haven't been reprinted. So we have this kind of selective attention that, because it's important to us now, we could still miss things that were really important for Tolkien at the time. We got to look at what was happening then. But also it really gave me a glimpse of kind of like what his childhood was like, his childhood readings, his literary ambiance as a young man. And it was so striking to me that he would have been walking by the house of this local literary hero that it actually inspired the prelude to the book, because I felt that this surely was something that would have been important to Tolkien as a young man.
My impression from the picture is that he had a shadow of a beard, but he had no beard. I can't quite figure it out because he's clean shaven, but there seems to be a shadow of a full beard in the background there. So
well, examine the photo gallery with more attention. We'll see the details of Shorthouse.
I'm gonna
question from the chat site, which talks about sometimes Tolkien's prose seems to change. This is from Sydney Swanson, and she says sometimes there's a different flavor or rhythm to the prose. And do you think that was due to the fact that he was borrowing rhythms or prose styles from his sources?
That's a very interesting question. And I think that's it is true that there's these differences in rhythm, but it's very intentional. Tolkien is very deftly handling the rhythms on purpose. And I think that's actually a place we can see his improvement on his sources. Because, for instance, his use of archaic language and the high tone, if we look at, say, Lord Dunsany, or we look especially at William Morris. Morris is where he first got that idea. We know that he was inspired by Morris because he mentions it. His Fall of Gondolin is actually modeled after a Morris book. I mean, he says that. So we know that he was working with this, and his earliest stories are very much all in the high register. They're all super Morrisian, full of archaism. It's striking. And he grows out of it, basically. As his style matures, he is much more sparing with it. He reduces the amount of archaism that he uses. He actually reduces the amount of the high tone that he uses. And whereas Morris sustains this high tone steadily throughout the whole thing, Tolkien uses it for emphasis. He brings it in where he wants to raise the level, and then he'll break it with a bit of low tone, to kind of give a for effect, so that it doesn't become overstrained.
Right.
So he's really very, very deftly handling it. And I really think that there should be more attention to Tolkien's prose style than there is. I think he's a master stylist, and it's somewhat gotten overlooked. People hear a little bit of the archaic language and they think that's the whole thing. And it's not at all. But I think even when we realize that he has this masterful shifting, just seeing what the earlier authors were doing really highlights Tolkien's skill in how masterfully he's handling it in his works.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to just take a quick break to announce our book giveaway. And I promise we'll try to get through as many other questions as we can. We have quite a few in the stack here. So if you would like to be entered into a drawing for one of 3 copies, courtesy of Word on Fire, that are signed copies, so I understand graciously Holly has agreed to sign these, this is what you need to do. So listen up right now. You need to email the Wade Center, wade@wheaton.edu, and that should be going into the chat if you need to catch it, with the subject line, Tolkien's Modern Reading Book Giveaway. And we will draw from a selection of the emails that come through for 3 winners. So hang tight for that. I want to grab a question that was entered into the Q&A box, but also combine it with one from the chat so we can do 2 birds with 1 stone. Someone was asking about Tolkien reading modern children's literature, and then someone from the chat asked about Beatrix Potter in particular, and maybe along with that, just outlining how the book chapters are sectioned off would be helpful for people to understand the types of things you touch base on.
Right. Well, he read loads of children's literature. And in fact, he loved Beatrix Potter. He had great praise for her. And he even, I think we can make a good case that Potter's rabbits had an influence on the Hobbits. This is something I explore in my section on Beatrix Potter. But he, just the fact that he greatly admired her is I think really interesting. He approved of her handling of her style. He called it similar to lyric poetry. Great admiration for Beatrix Potter. So in terms of the structure, with all those masses of material, I aimed at a approximate chronological grouping, looking at, looking first at the things that were earlier, so the children's stories that he read when he was a boy, and then ending up with, the things that he read later in life, as a very, very rough approximation. And then within that, grouping it approximately by theme. So we have some chapters on children's literature. So we have actually several chapters in children's literature. If I look at my own table of contents, we can see that I've got, Victorian, post-Victorian, and then I've got a whole chapter on George MacDonald. I've got then 2 chapters, several chapters on adventure literature, and one on Rider Haggard, one on William Morris. So certain authors get their own chapter. And then I move into, I have a chapter on, which I call Fine Fabling, in which I put some of the more mythopoeic authors who could have fit in other places, but I put them there. Some of these could go in several places, but I had to put them somewhere. I've got a chapter on science fiction, and then I wrap up with kind of an overview of, basically filling in the corners all the authors that didn't fit anywhere else. But I will note something that you might have noticed from that overview, that there is no chapter on the Inklings. And that was a very deliberate choice that I made, because early on it seemed to me, well, obviously I'll have a chapter on the works of the Inklings. And then I realized that this is a trap that we fall into all too commonly, that because we know of the Inklings as a group, we categorize all their writings together. But in fact, they were a very diverse group, and they wrote different sorts of things. And Tolkien read all sorts of different things. He didn't have a category in his mind of Inklings, so why should I? So I actually made the very deliberate structural choice to not address the Inklings as a group. So Barfield gets mentioned in a children's literature chapter because Tolkien knew his children's book, The Silver Trumpet. Williams gets addressed in the science fiction chapter because it more or less worked. I could have put Williams in a couple of different places, but he fit well in the science fiction chapter. And Lewis, alone of my authors, gets in two places because his Narnia Chronicles I discuss in the children's literature chapter, but then his other works I discuss in science fiction because of the Ransom trilogy. Because Lewis is significant enough that he needed both those pieces need to be discussed, but I wanted to handle them where they fit in terms of the other genres that Tolkien was reading. And I found that breaking up the Inklings in this way really helped me get a better, fresh perspective on the way that Tolkien interacted with them so that I could kind of break out assumptions I might otherwise have fallen into about, well, of course, this is how they would have influenced him.
Right, right. Now,
Excellent.
you mentioned Beatrice Potter. Do you want to talk about the influence of Harry Potter novels on Tolkien? No, that's a bad question. I'm sorry.
That
That's
was an anachronism.
Here's a chronology snafu.
no, no. You could go the other way. You could say that Harry Potter is kind of like Tolkien transposed into an English boarding school. You have the minor people
there because we have too many other things to talk about, and that is
okay. Well, we won't go there. Let me go somewhere. In the chat room, Robert Schuster asked about orcs, and we talked about Hanau earlier. They have a rational sense and a moral sense, and he said, "What was Tolkien's view of orcs?" In terms of the fact that they seem to be just sort of these robotic, evil soldiers, but other times they seem to have personality. So how did you, in doing source studies, how did you deal with the idea of orcs? Are they moral beings? Are they not moral beings? How do you interpret them?
Well, that is a very, very interesting question and a vexed one in Tolkien scholarship. And indeed, Tolkien himself never fully came to a conclusion.
Right.
There's very late notes in the history of Middle Earth where he's still, at the end of his life, he's still trying to figure out the question of the orcs. Now, for the most part, he seems to have focused on the idea that they were more mechanistic or more like ants controlled by the will of Sauron or the will of Melkor. That seems to be primarily how he was viewing them, that we would say they were not now, they were more, he calls something like parrots. They could echo speech, but they weren't really rational beings. But we can't really go into it now, but I did find a very, very interesting link between Tolkien's conception of the orcs and the Romans in the William Morris novel, The House of the Wolf.
Oh, that was very interesting.
It turns out that I think there's a very compelling case to be made that the Romans, who are the bad guys in the House of the Wolfings, that they provide a significant point of influence, even as maybe even source material for the orcs. And I think that if that's the case, and I really think I've made a good case for it, if that's the case, it helps to explain some of the reason why Tolkien had such a problem with the orcs, because they came from a literary inspiration that was not quite fitting with his Middle Earth legendarium. And so they were never quite fully digested into the legendarium. They always were slightly ajar, and it drove him nuts, I think. He could never quite get them to fit. And I think that that's connection with Morris and the Romans maybe helps us understand why they don't quite fit. And I think shed some light on what he's doing with the orcs. So I commend people to my Morris chapter for that.
Good.
Let's try to get in at least one more question before we announce our winners. And I apologize in advance if we don't get to all of your questions. We've had a lot of great audience engagement tonight. Okay, Martha asks, as a Tolkien scholar and translator, and especially as a trainer of future translators who use Tolkien in such training, I'm so grateful for your insight. Would you consider that seeing Tolkien as a translator helps you see him in light of modern literature?
Yes, I think that's a great insight. It does, because translators are always moving back and forth between one and the other. And I think that's what Tolkien's doing. He's always looking at modern culture, and then he's engaging with it. He's kind of going back and forth. He's not stuck in either the past or the future. He's got a dynamism to him. And so I think that image of him as a translator between past and present and future really helps us to see a kind of a more dynamic picture of him as a thinker that is, I think, more accurate.
Excellent. Well, should we go ahead and announce our winners? All right. For the 3 free copies of Tolkien's Modern Reading, the winners are Sophie Smith, Mike Wilburn, and Justin Kowalski. So congratulations to all of you. And we'll be in touch about how to get your copies. And I want to go ahead and transition into some closing announcements here. Let me go ahead and put these in the chat so that everybody will have all the information they need, because there is some additional detail there that would be helpful for you. So for a limited time, you may purchase Tolkien's Modern Reading from the publisher, Word on Fire, at a 20% discount with free US shipping. Visit wordonfire.org/Tolkien, and there's no code, no anything, right, Holly? They just, have set this up for a limited amount of time that you get 20% off. And Holly has told us that they are very on top of their shipping, which is great news. In fact, they've been more on top than Amazon in some ways. So that's good news to want to get it from the publisher directly. The next Wade Center event is actually in 3 weeks on Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m. Dr. Kristen Page will have her third and final lecture in this academic year's Hansen Lectureship Series titled Creation's Call, Stewardship Lessons from Middle-earth and Narnia. And that will be in the same format via Zoom and then live streamed on YouTube simultaneously. So you can find the registration link for that in the chat box as well. And if you are not already on the Wade Center's email notification list, we invite you to sign up via the link in the chat box there, where you can receive event announcements and other Wade Center news, like this great event we had tonight. You could be on the announcement list to learn more about these kinds of things in the future. So I want to thank my co-host, David Downing, for joining us with the presentation this evening and leading the questions with me. And thank you so much to Holly for this wonderful event. I hope everybody attending got to learn some new things and get really excited about the gift to all of us and to Tolkien scholarship in general, Tolkien's Modern Reading, the book. I hope you all can go out and snatch this up and enjoy the read. Any last closing thoughts, Holly?
Well, I just want to thank you and thank David and just the Wade. Again, the Wade is such a great resource for scholars. There's so much out there that we can be looking at. And I just really hope that Tolkien's Modern Reading will really help people have just a richer view of his creative imagination, and it will encourage people to go and just look for more information and see that more well-rounded view, because it's spending 10 years working on a project is quite a while, and I found this is a great gift. I found that I love Tolkien even more at the end of this 10 years than I did at the beginning, and that is saying something.
It really is.
Yeah.
And just the amount that I've learned about him has just increased my admiration for his genius, and it has increased the admiration that I have for his writings and my enjoyment. And one of the things that I really tried to do in Tolkien's Modern Reading is to kind of take a page out of Tolkien's own book. And I wanted this to be appreciative criticism. I wanted this to be a book that you read it and then you love his writings even more. And I hope that that's something that it accomplishes, that you read it and then you go back and you read The Lord of the Rings and you read The Hobbit and you love it even more than you did before, because that's how I feel after writing this book.
That's awesome. And I think Middle-earth fans can agree that the deeper you delve, the more you find. I think Tolkien is similar in that manner, isn't he? It's a great note to leave on. So keep digging, keep exploring, keep enjoying, everyone watching. Thank you again, David and Holly. Have a good night, everyone.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Holly.